War does not end when the shooting stops. Sometimes the most difficult battles happen after the guns fall silent. In January of 1945, during the brutal winter fighting of World War II, General George S. Patton received information that would test his command, his discipline, and his understanding of justice in war. American soldiers, men under his command, had allegedly executed around 50 captured SS guards. And the question was simple, but the answer was not. What does a commander do when his own soldiers cross the line? The context. To understand Patton's response, we first need to understand where this happened and why emotions were already out of control. Only weeks earlier, the world had learned about the Malmedy massacre. During the Battle of the Bulge, SS troops under Joachim Peiper had executed 84 unarmed American prisoners of war near the Belgian town of Malmedy. The news spread fast. American soldiers were furious, angry, and deeply shaken. For many frontline units, the idea of taking SS troops prisoner after that felt impossible. The alleged executions. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, reports began to surface. In several isolated incidents, captured SS guards were shot after surrendering. In one case, approximately 50 SS prisoners were allegedly executed. The men responsible were not criminals. They were exhausted soldiers, many of whom had seen their friends murdered only days before. But war crimes are still war crimes, and Patton knew that. Patton's reputation. George S. Patton was known as an aggressive commander, a hard man, a believer in relentless offense. But there was one thing Patton cared deeply about: discipline. He believed discipline was what separated an army from a mob. And he also understood something else. If the U.S. Army became known for executing prisoners, it would destroy moral authority and invite retaliation against American POWs. Patton learns the truth. When Patton was informed about the executions, he did not celebrate them. He did not excuse them. Instead, he ordered quiet investigations, not public, not political. Patton was walking a tightrope. Punish too harshly and he would crush men who had already been pushed beyond human limits. Ignore it completely, and he would signal that atrocities were acceptable. His private orders. Behind closed doors, Patton made his position clear. He stated that executing prisoners was illegal and must not become standard practice. But at the same time, he showed a level of realism few commanders admitted publicly. He reportedly told officers that in the chaos of fast-moving combat, certain incidents were better not aggressively pursued unless absolutely necessary. This was not approval. It was containment. Why no major trials happened? Unlike the SS officers responsible for Malmedy, American soldiers involved were not publicly tried or executed. There were several reasons. First, evidence was often unclear. Second, witnesses were unreliable or dead. And third, the U.S. command understood the difference between systematic murder and battlefield breakdowns under extreme stress. Patton knew that making an example of these soldiers would not serve justice. It would serve headlines. Patton's moral line. Despite his reputation, Patton did not believe American forces should descend to the level of the SS. He believed victory meant more than winning battles. It meant preserving what the army stood for. In his own words, war was hell. But that did not excuse everything done in it. The unspoken reality. What happened to those soldiers? Most returned to duty. Some were reassigned. Others carried the weight silently for the rest of their lives. There were no medals, no praise, no celebration, just silence. And sometimes, silence is the way armies survive their own actions. Final reflection. Patton's response was not perfect. It was not clean, but it was human. He enforced discipline without destroying morale. He acknowledged reality without endorsing brutality, and in doing so, he revealed a truth about war that many prefer to ignore. Even the good side is forced to make impossible choices. History often asks who was right and who was wrong. But moments like this remind us that war does not create heroes or villains. It reveals people, broken, angry, human. And sometimes, commanders like Patton were left not to judge history, but to hold an army together long enough to end the war. But Patton's decision did not exist in isolation. Above him stood the highest levels of Allied command, men who understood that how this war was fought would shape the world that followed it. As reports moved upward, the question reached headquarters quietly, without press releases, without public statements. What do you do when justice, discipline, and survival pull in opposite directions? The view from higher command, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, was painfully aware of what was at stake. The Allies were not just fighting to defeat Germany. They were fighting to prove that their cause was morally different. The Geneva Convention mattered. Rules mattered. Because once rules disappear, wars become nothing more than organized revenge. And Eisenhower knew something else. If German forces believed American troops executed prisoners as policy, every captured American soldier would be in mortal danger. A dangerous precedent. The SS were not regular soldiers, they were ideological fighters, fanatics, but once captured, they were still prisoners of war. If exceptions were made, even understandable ones, those exceptions could become habits, and habits in war spread fast. This was the fear inside Allied command, not outrage, not denial, but escalation. Quiet containment. Instead of public courts-martial, the response remained controlled. Orders were reinforced. Rules were reissued. Officers were reminded that prisoners must be taken alive whenever possible. There were no speeches, no announcements, just instructions. The goal was simple: stop it from happening again, without tearing the army apart. The soldiers' reality. But on the ground, the reality was brutal. American troops were discovering concentration camps, mass graves, starved civilians. What the SS had done was no longer rumor. It was visible, smellable, impossible to forget. For many soldiers, mercy felt like betrayal, and restraint felt unnatural. Patton's internal conflict. Patton himself was not immune to anger. His private diary reveals a man deeply disturbed by what German forces had done. Yet he remained firm on one point. An army that loses discipline loses everything. He believed that victory meant nothing if it turned his soldiers into what they were fighting. This was Patton's line. Not softness, control. Why the issue was buried. Historians later asked, why was this not discussed openly? The answer is uncomfortable. Because war, especially near its end, is managed as much by silence as by orders. Public trials would have damaged morale. They would have fueled propaganda. They would have complicated a war already costing millions of lives. So the decision was made, not to erase what happened, but not to amplify it. Justice versus survival. This was not moral clarity. It was moral compromise. The Allied command chose to preserve the larger mission over absolute accountability, not because the killings were right, but because they feared what would happen if the army fractured from within. A different standard. Compare this to the SS officers who ordered the Malmedy massacre. They were investigated, tried, convicted. Why the difference? Because theirs was systematic execution, planned, ordered, and repeated. What happened under American command was seen as isolated collapse, not doctrine. This distinction mattered deeply to military leadership. The unspoken message. To soldiers, the message was indirect but clear. Do not do this again. The army will not protect you if it becomes a pattern. Discipline was reasserted. Quietly, firmly, and slowly the chaos of vengeance was brought back under control. The cost of silence. But silence has a cost. Those involved carried it alone. There were no confessions, no public forgiveness, no closure, just memory, and memory, unlike records, does not fade easily. Transition forward. The war would end only months later. Germany would surrender. The world would celebrate victory. But questions like this one did not disappear. They waited, in history books, in private diaries, in the minds of men who had crossed lines they never imagined approaching. And in part 2, we will look at what this moment reveals about war itself, about Patton's legacy, and about the uncomfortable truth that morality in war is rarely black and white.